Is the idea of America sound? Will the center hold? Can a system completely based on the idea that all men can trust in the guarantee of the rights the Constitution gives them last indefinitely? The early 19th century will provide some of the first major challenges to the American experiment. Time to put our money where our mouth is and prove that not only can we beat back external threats, but we can live together as a nation as well. I'm Anne Grace Evans, and this is a practical guide to American history. Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, would bring his values to the White House. During his inaugural address, he stated, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists," a direct appeal to move beyond the recent animosity. He assured the Federalist minority that their rights would be protected, stating, "The minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression." To commemorate his inauguration, the town of Cheshire, Massachusetts, presented him with a giant wheel of cheese, with the inscription, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." The cheese was so big that Jefferson held a public dinner on Independence Day, where people could come and take a piece. It's one of those stories that adds to Jefferson's image as the rustic friend of the common man. Thomas Jefferson was really the first person who got to live in the executive mansion. It was only just being finished at the end of John Adams' term. Jefferson thought it was too grand, stating that it was big enough for 2 emperors, 1 pope, and the Grand Lama in the bargain. But despite this complaint, he did confer with architect Benjamin Latrobe, architecture being one of his many interests, about how he might improve and expand the building. He helped design the east and west colonnades, which link today's White House to the west and what was the East Wing. Jefferson was a bit eccentric, always inventing things and developing new hobbies and interests. Some of these ended up influencing the culture and are a part of the America we live in today. We've already talked about his love of ice cream, which he picked up in France, but Jefferson put his mark on the presidency and the country in lots of non-political ways. It's been said that the president and his White House have helped set the fashion for the country, but in a time when the president and political leaders were really the main celebrities of their day, this was especially true. Thomas Jefferson was a contradictory person because, while it was true that he was an unfussy man of the people, dressing casually and then eating by himself at a local tavern on the day of his inauguration, he also appreciated a more elevated way of life. Massive Francophile that he was, Jefferson wanted the executive mansion to reflect his more sophisticated ideas about what the standard of living for a gentleman ought to be. Not extravagant or aristocratic exactly, but still refined, with an eye to comfort and modernity. The world was approaching the turning point of the 19th century. Europe was looking to new frontiers of science and technology, and Jefferson liked to keep up to date. He installed an iron stove in the kitchen, switched over candles to oil lamps, and replaced the outdoor privy with indoor water closets. Americans had the reputation of being, quote, the grossest feeders of any civilized nation ever known, with the diet heavy in red meat and potatoes. Jefferson, the foodie-in-chief, tried to introduce a more cultured, vegetable-forward diet to the lawmakers who attended his dinners in the green room. Not everyone got it. One congressman found one of the president's favorite European dishes, macaroni and cheese, quote, not agreeable. In his own way, Jefferson was a visionary, just like Hamilton seeing an American future that would be the envy of the world. Only instead of big business and manufacturing, the thing that would make the United States a global leader was its adherence to Republican virtues. Others would be awed by the example of this democratic republic. rising in such a short time from basically a collection of frontiersmen, scraping together a civilization, to a country that could equal the standard of any European nation. Someday. What the Democratic Republicans believed would be key to realizing their prosperous vision for the United States was cutting taxes and paying down the debt. If you're going to cut the debt without raising taxes, there is only one course of action you can take: cut spending. Under Jefferson, the debt was reduced by 30%. To achieve this, Congress cut military spending by reducing the number of soldiers in the Army as well as the number of ships in the Navy. However, they didn't totally neglect the armed forces, establishing a military academy at West Point, the same West Point Benedict Arnold had tried to turn over to the British. The thinking went that the size of the Army might be reduced, but at least America would have officers with the training and knowledge to conduct operations. Jefferson's policies were popular, handily winning him re-election and delivering majorities for his party in both chambers of Congress. But if the main goal of the government remained promoting the prosperity of the United States, then Jefferson's plans for a weaker central authority would prove insufficient. Popular as it may have been at the time, reducing the size of the Navy to save money was not a smart idea in the long run. In the late 18th century, pirates from the Muslim states of northern Africa, the Barbary states, as they were known to Americans, would hassle shipping along their coasts, stealing cargo and selling sailors into slavery. The rulers of these states claimed that they could bring the piracy attacks to an end, for a price. But as with the XYZ affair, Americans did not support the idea of paying tribute. They would rather fight instead. Too bad they had cut the number of ships in the Navy. Those might have come in handy. The Naval Act of 1794 had authorized the equipping of 6 frigates to make up the first United States Navy. But the First Barbary War was really its first proving ground. In response to the taking of American ships, the U.S. Navy blockaded the port of Tripoli. The actions of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps in these engagements helped establish the reputation of the United States military, garnering the admiration of no less a man than British Admiral Horatio Nelson, who hailed one American raid as the most bold and daring act of the age. The war, which lasted 3 years, was so significant for boosting America's martial image that the line, "To the shores of Tripoli," became a part of the Marine hymn. The Constitution requires the government to provide for the common defense, because what is the use of citizenship of a country if it doesn't guarantee your protection? Despite Jefferson's best efforts to cut the size of the military in order to minimize the power of the central government, it turns out that having a strong federal force is what's necessary to protect the American dream. This is a phrase we use all the time, but what does it mean really? Or perhaps more accurately for our purposes, what did it mean to Americans of the late 18th and early 19th centuries? During Jefferson's administration, the country was still mostly rural, very much in keeping with his vision of a nation shaped by those who worked the land. Those who understood what it took to grow something from nothing, through merit and ingenuity, would best appreciate what measures the country needed to take to achieve prosperity. Jefferson and his fellow Democratic Republicans didn't necessarily see how their perspective might be narrow and biased. But if the people who already had the land were the ones who got to inform the decisions, then wouldn't all the decisions favor them, without taking into account the needs of those who, for whatever reason, had no land and were trying to change that fact? And what exactly would Thomas Jefferson, the owner of an inherited plantation worked by over 100 enslaved people, know about that kind of struggle and work ethic? Yet to this day, the central concept of the American dream is for people to be ruler over their own piece of the world, no matter how small. And there's certainly something to that. To be rooted and have a stake in this country, a point of leverage from which to create generational wealth. People need a place to start. So it becomes a chicken and egg situation. The wealth and influence necessary to affect policy comes from a person's land. But it's very difficult to get that land to begin with if there aren't already policies in place to help the landless. Congress had granted land to the Ohio Company of Associates, land which had been the catalyst for 2 wars because of the high demand for new land for Americans. New communities of people, veterans, immigrants, those whose luck had run out in the East, as Benjamin Franklin had put it, started springing up on the, quote, frontier. In planned communities like those the Ohio Company laid out, newcomers were given predetermined lots of land on which to raise a cabin. As in the Puritan settlements of old, towns were generally surrounded by expansive fields. There was the mill, a social hub for the community, because sooner or later, everyone needed to come to get their corn and wheat milled. The church, and as mandated by law, the schoolhouse, the basic roots of a society. More people come, attracted by the opportunity afforded by the land, and once the basic threshold of being able to feed themselves is met, they diversify to address other needs, like the arts and other luxuries and comforts. The rate of migration to the Ohio Territory facilitated the exchange of goods between the frontier and the East, but what really opened the Ohio market to the East, and vice versa, was the ease of movement along the Ohio River. The shipbuilding industry in Ohio exploded as raw goods and agricultural products flowed east and finished items like furniture flowed west. When Ohio became a state in 1803, this territory, which had originally been settled by people prepared to venture into the unknown for the promise of affordable land, quote, may be considered as New England in miniature, with its idyllic towns of clapboard houses and budding industries. Of course, such a dream wasn't immediately possible for everyone, but there was always the hope, no matter how unlikely or remote. There existed a paradox for women. If you were widowed or unmarried, you maintained autonomy over yourself and your property. But unless you inherited, the opportunities for earning enough money as a solo woman to buy property of one's own were limited. The chances at the American dream were even grimmer for those living in slavery. It was possible to buy one's way out, although the cost was $300 to $500, and sometimes up to $1,000 per individual, and that was only if the slave owner were honest. Instances of an enslaved person attempting to buy their freedom were sometimes met with the slave owner simply taking the money. Then there was the matter of one's family members, who might be split between different properties depending on whether white society deemed their value to be greater as a unit or separate. The only way they could be reunited was through greater depletion of funds that couldn't then go toward a farm, a house, or a business of one's own. But if we admire the people with the land, who make something from nothing, then we should also honor the work ethic and determination of people striving to have the same opportunities. Here is the real truth at the heart of the American dream. It is the hope, not the property itself, that gives us a stake in America. That's why the wording of the Declaration of Independence diverged from John Locke's original to become an inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness. But even then, there were cracks starting to form. What is the best way to pursue prosperity and happiness? By looking forward or looking back? One of the reasons that the Founding Fathers had punted on the question of slavery in the Constitution is because they thought there was a chance it might die out on its own. For the scale of farm labor that most Americans were practicing in the late 18th century, the institution of slavery didn't make financial sense until a new technology changed everything. Eli Whitney's cotton gin was a machine that separated cotton fibers from their seeds, a process that was very time-consuming by hand. But the speed of processing cotton dramatically increased. It became more profitable, and the demand for this lightweight fabric grew. Slave owners, doing the math, realized that it would actually be quite lucrative for them to go all in on cotton, which required a large amount of enslaved labor to harvest. Meanwhile, the non-agricultural economies in the North resented the extra representation that the South got from their enslaved laborers. With extra influence to make decisions beneficial to their agricultural economies, Southern lawmakers in Congress could stop actions that Northerners hoped would benefit their developing industrial societies. These two competing visions couldn't coexist in the same spaces, and so naturally the urge to spread out, to find new places to claim and shape to a specific vision of what America should be, started to influence national politics. The United States of America needed more land, and it just so happened that at this time, more land became available. French dictator Napoleon Bonaparte was in need of cash. His military victories were what had allowed him to seize power in France. And so naturally he assumed that any uprising in his sprawling empire could be dealt with fairly quickly. In the case of Haiti, he was wrong. Two formerly enslaved generals, Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, led a revolution, an uprising of Haiti's enslaved population that declared their independence from France. The French were never able to regain control, no matter how much money they sank into the task. So Napoleon was looking to offload some assets. The United States acquired most of the lands of the Mississippi River Basin, running from the river to the Rocky Mountains. President Thomas Jefferson's main aim in acquiring this land was control of the port of New Orleans. To fund the purchase of this Louisiana territory, the Treasury Department issued sovereign bonds, which relied on the legitimacy of the powerful central entity that Hamilton had built. And that's how a president who had come to office with his own vision of what America should be, a country of farmers largely unhindered by the federal government, made the U.S. Treasury foot the bill for the largest national expansion to date. It is with pleasure that I announce to you the safe arrival of myself and party. In obedience to your orders, we have penetrated the continent of North America to the Pacific Ocean and sufficiently explored the interior. The Missouri and all its branches from the Cheyenne upwards abound more in beaver and common otter than any other streams on earth. If the government will only aid the enterprise of our citizens, I am fully convinced that we shall shortly derive the benefits of a most lucrative trade from this source, and that in the course of 10 or 12 years, a tour across the continent by the route mentioned will be undertaken by individuals with as little concern as a voyage across the Atlantic is at present. Thus reads the letter of Meriwether Lewis. The addition of the Louisiana Territory to the United States of America, by so greatly increasing the size of the country, added to its prestige. But it also presented an interesting question for the more established eastern states. What even is this place? What did it really mean to be American? A lot of American culture up to that point was still a hand-me-down from England. But there was a burgeoning sense of wanting to craft a unique identity, to fully sever the old connection to the mother country. Since the end of the Revolution, conscious effort had gone into designing and building up the country in a distinctly American style. Charles Bulfinch and Asher Benjamin were two architects, though at the time being an architect was more hobby than career path, who championed this new federal style. The more grandiose manner of late Georgian architecture morphed into the simple elegance of plain, symmetrical structures with low hip roofs and flanking chimneys. As for music, it too was undergoing an Americanization process. Musical theorists like Andrew Law and William Little and William Smith developed standardized primers for musical notation and education. Little and Smith's major innovation was the shape note, where for the traditional diatonic scale of music, Mi is depicted with a diamond, Fa is a right-sided triangle, Sol is the standard oval, and La is a rectangle. The purpose of this was to make it easier for choral singers and churchgoers to read music. True to America's founding roots, music was largely made for spiritual reasons, as part of a congregation. To this day, you can see how the folk tradition of coming together in impromptu worship has shaped how music has developed in America. But also intermingled with the desire to stay true to a tradition of religious devotion was the desire to be fashionable. Music shop owner Benjamin Carr was the embodiment of this. Born in London, he came to Philadelphia, where he supplemented his income publishing and selling sheet music by serving as church organist and choir master. As he grew and expanded his music printing business, opening another store in New York City, he tried to stay ahead of commercial demand with new offerings of music that people had never heard before. Not just the same psalms they could hear in church, but original compositions from American composers, including himself. His Federal Overture combined American folk tradition like Yankee Doodle and the fashions of European music. But those were changing too. Mozart had died in 1791, but his musical style continued to influence composers. The classical period of music, personified by Mozart, had a very distinct sound. Beautiful, airy melodies filled with runs of trills, anchored by a firmly grounded bass line. It's a style you can hear in A Kentucky Volunteer, the first piece of music copyrighted in the United States. The reason it sounds so grounded is that it uses a basic major scale in fragments. The result is a very standard and expected harmony. Once an idea is started in the music, you know where it's going. Ludwig Beethoven was one of the composers influenced by Mozart. But by 1803, he was starting to take inspiration from elsewhere. Napoleon had just crowned himself emperor of a greatly expanded France. Between his rise and the changes brought about by America's Revolution, the world looked very different from the one in which Mozart and other classical composers had written their symphonies. Beethoven writes a symphony dedicated to Napoleon, Eroica, to symbolize these historic shifts away from the old order of things. The revolutions of the late 18th century had completely upended the rigidly fixed way of doing things, and so did the structure of his new piece. It's bolder, with a greater emphasis on these dramatic single notes. But probably the most marked difference about Eroica is that it's weaving a story that follows its own path, and you can't be certain exactly where it'll end up. His individual melodic decisions throughout don't conform to the old mold of strict harmonies of deconstructed chords. His bass line colors outside the lines. This is also the time of the Romantic poets, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. These bohemian free spirits, finding Britain much too square for their liking, embarked on the grand tour, experimenting with words, along with other things. These creatives were looking for enlightenment, but also just a really good time. If Voltaire and Rousseau and their intellectual heirs in the American Founding Fathers were looking to use philosophical thought to establish the rules for an ideal and just society, then the Romantics were looking to squeeze some meaning out of that rigidity. Political thinkers were trying to create a world where people were free to speak and think as they pleased. But a more poetic thinker might question, what then is the purpose of free speech and free thought? What is the point if one is not pushing the boundaries of what is permissible to experience something real, something that could only be gleaned from approaching the limit of fear, of acceptability, and realizing that you don't have to be constrained by it? Though the figure of the Byronic hero became the ultimate avatar of the rebellious yet sensitive bad boy, it is probably Mary Shelley, whose work is still best recognized in the story of Frankenstein. In a competition with her male peers to create the most frightening ghost story, she took inspiration from experiments scientists at the time were conducting on how electric currents could animate human tissue. These romantics might have been a bit decadent and debauched for American tastes, but they were defying convention and embracing science and progress, and that was something that could be admired. Like Beethoven's foray into his heroic era, the Romantic thinker was a natural evolution of the Enlightenment thinker, a person who understands the concept of a system constructed to preserve the rights of man, but refuses to play by the rules of that system. What has come before might enable Romantic thinkers, but it doesn't constrain them. They're interested in new experiences. In the spirit of forging paths that haven't been trodden, Around this time, Connecticut politician Noah Webster begins to gather spellings and pronunciations of English words that he thinks represent American English. Because if it were really meant to be lieutenant, then it would be spelled with an F, wouldn't it? His American Dictionary of the English Language won't be published until 1828, but already in this period, he's an evangelist for the American language, believing that Americans should take pride in their societal and artistic achievements. His patriotic project to shape a distinctly American culture was no doubt influenced by increasing tensions with Europe, and it was echoed by a generation of writers and artists who felt the same. The Knickerbocker Group took its name from the author Washington Irving, who went by the pseudonym Knickerbocker. Based in New York City, they became some of the first successful American writers who didn't just talk about liberty all the time. Besides Washington Irving, the group included James Fenimore Cooper and William Cullen Bryant. Their style of writing was very tongue-in-cheek. If Thomas Paine and his generation were characterized by their earnestness, then the Knickerbocker generation took great delight poking fun at them. The Knickerbockers developed their own brand of political satire, characterized by Irving's novel, A History of New York. Pretending to be a Dutch historian, Irving wrote a humorous sketch of self-important New Yorkers. Though his writing was offensive to some, in his own way, he was embodying the tradition of questioning the status quo. Deep down, the writing of the Knickerbockers is idealistic, not making these observations to tear society down, but to hold it to a higher standard. If America were truly being held to a higher standard as a society, then they would need the type of institutions that fostered culture. Benjamin Franklin had established the Library Company of Philadelphia, a subscription service, in 1731 as a way for the larger public to have access to books. But beyond this, outside of universities, cities didn't have public places for people to come to absorb knowledge. Painter Charles Willson Peale began his own collection of art, which he then expanded to include natural history specimens that he called the Philadelphia Museum. In 1801, the museum even acquired a mastodon skeleton from an archaeological dig in New York, which they charged visitors 50 cents to see. The American Antiquarian Society was founded in 1812 in Worcester, Massachusetts, as a society for documenting United States history. So, not exactly the great royal collections that European monarchs had built up over centuries, but still places of American discovery and inquiry. Despite these attempts to forge a proud national identity, they were still looked on as inferior by the European powers that be. The great empires didn't really believe that a bunch of former colonies could get their act together to present any real competition for the existing status quo, and so would naturally offer no resistance when these empires decided to push around American shipping. England and France were at war, again, and as determined as the United States was to keep out of it, British actions in particular made it difficult for the government to remain neutral. Britain needed sailors to fight Napoleon, more sailors than were willing to volunteer. As a result, the British Navy engaged in the practice of impressment, quite literally kidnapping men into naval service. To escape this fate, many men with seafaring backgrounds emigrated to the United States, where American merchants were more than happy to pay them good wages for their expertise. But since these men were still, in Great Britain's eyes, British subjects, they were still fair game to impress, no matter where on the high seas they were. British warships would hijack American ships, disrupting trade, so that they could kidnap men into service who were now American refugees. An incident in 1807, where the British frigate Leopard went to intercept the American frigate Chesapeake, ended in cannon fire and the death and kidnap of several Americans. People were outraged and viewed the Leopard's actions as a declaration of war. But the United States was nowhere close to being ready to fight another war with Britain, despite recent military successes against the Tripolitan states. But something had to be done. American honor was at stake. A nation where the notion of citizenship, a protected status, didn't actually afford you protection from the actions of foreign powers, couldn't really be considered much of a nation at all. Congress decided to fight back with the embargo of 1807. The act forbade all imports and exports since Jefferson figured that British factory workers needed American raw goods far more than Americans needed their finished products. He just didn't seem to account for the fact that farmers, the very people he thought were the backbone of America, might really need those foreign markets to make a living. The shipbuilders and maritime workers, like our friends in Ohio, also struggled since all American merchant vessels were now forbidden from leaving their harbors. The government of Thomas Jefferson, the man who had once been so adamantly opposed to such strong central actions, became responsible for the most invasive and reviled legislation since the Alien and Sedition Acts. It goes to show that the grand schemes presidents may have when they enter office might have to be altered when faced with the realities of the job. For Jefferson, the realization that he had to be commander-in-chief for a whole expanding United States brought home the necessity that sometimes the central government has to have the power to act unilaterally for everyone. Jefferson may have repealed the Embargo Act before he left office. It was so unpopular that he had to. But that still left his successor, Secretary of State James Madison, with a very volatile situation. Napoleon was a very slippery operator. He would make promises of trade deals, and then turn around and break them. Never actually serious in his dealings with the United States, but rather more interested in driving a wedge between Congress and Great Britain. One political cartoon showed Jefferson being robbed by both George III and Napoleon. Madison was soon stalked by the same unpopular image, allowing America to be taken advantage of by both Britain and France. Luckily, he had a new member of Congress to fight his corner. Henry Clay was born into a prominent Virginia family, but the Clay clan had realized early the promise that lay in the West and had come to establish themselves in the fast-growing city of Lexington, Kentucky. He had established himself as an influential voice when, as a young lawyer, he had gained popularity from speaking out against the Alien and Sedition Acts. In 1810, he was appointed to fill a vacant Kentucky Senate seat, and this is how his long congressional career, promoting industry and commerce, and above all, the unity of the nation, began. Henry Clay would continue to play an outsized role in American history, but in those early days, he was a loyal mouthpiece for the president, urging Congress to support efforts to push back against foreign efforts to intimidate the United States. Madison was also aided by his wife Dolly, who held bipartisan get-togethers at the Executive Mansion. As alluded to earlier, Washington, D.C. was a city that had big dreams of being an international capital, but was more like a country town, with muddy streets and a few grander buildings here and there. Paradoxically, D.C. represented the height of fashionable society in America, because it's where democracy's big names met on the same stage. America was a new type of society, but also a deliberate throwback to a more ancient one. If the United States were taking the Roman Republic as its model, then the template for a well-lived life was to distinguish oneself through political influence, to run for office. In a land where everyone was an immigrant, everyone, at least theoretically, started with a level playing field. How far you and your family could advance wasn't down to birth or pedigree, but hard work and skill. The ultimate sign that you had made it was to be in Washington, hobnobbing with all your peers, who had also made it to the pinnacle of American life. The problem is that during the early years, the Executive Mansion was really the only decent place in town for these types of get-togethers. So congressmen and their wives were basically at the mercy of the president's hospitality. John and Abigail Adams didn't live in the president's house for very long, and Thomas Jefferson was a widower. So Dolly Madison was really the first person to occupy the role of First Lady. She would wear a feathered turban to host teas, dinner parties, and eventually evening balls. Women's fashion had mellowed quite a bit since the days of colonial stomachers. Since the days of the French Revolution, style in general had come to reject the frillier adornments of the 18th century. Ironically, it was actually Marie Antoinette whose preference for a more casual look in her downtime inspired a style called the robe à la reine, which is more or less the style that women came to wear in the early 19th century. If you've seen Bridgerton or any Jane Austen adaptation, this is the time period we're in. Ladies ditched the stiff, wide skirts in favor of empire waists and simple, flowering skirts. The men were the real dandies during this period, none more notorious than the famous fashion icon Beau Brummel. His maxim was, to be truly elegant, one should not be noticed. He was the one who moved men's fashion away from powdered wigs and pastel silks. Think, what would Mr. Darcy wear? The who's who of the American Republic would gather for polite, if occasionally awkward, conversation while their wives helped foster political connections with sweet treats and music. If you've read Pride and Prejudice, then you're somewhat familiar with the etiquette and ritual of these types of parlor parties. Light refreshments, while the ladies exhibited their skill at the piano. The popularity of parlor music prompted the sale of many collections of songs to be played at small parties, for attendees to join in song or organize impromptu dances. So many people attended Dolly Madison's parties that they were referred to as squeezes for the amount of guests she would squeeze in. Even the British minister in the U.S. was impressed by her soirees, finding that they met even his snooty standards. But circumstance was about to change this. Up to this point, those at the height of fashion, the politicos and those established in American life, were still mostly deferring to Britain on the finer things. Sure, America had come a long way, creating its own unique folk art style, but for delicate porcelain and bone china, as well as the more impressive pieces of furniture, those with money to spare were still going to the European source. American ingenuity still could not quite compete with an old-world tradition of higher quality goods. But the Embargo Act had demonstrated the need to find alternative sources of luxury items. While it had been repealed, deteriorating relations with Great Britain and France prompted Congress to institute the Non-Intercourse Act in 1809. Imports and exports could resume, just not with France or Great Britain, which is probably where most of those luxury home goods would be coming from. But since the beginning, we've been a nation of improvisers, and we're not going to stop now, not when there are new markets and opportunities to pursue. In South Carolina, the porcelain industry thrived as potters in the Edgefield district took advantage of the new gap in the market. Cabinet makers in major cities began to make more elevated offerings to capitalize on wealthy patrons' need for fine furniture. So while uncertain relations with Europe remained an uncomfortable storm cloud on the horizon, life in the eastern United States continued pretty much as usual. Meanwhile, in the western territories, a new movement was stirring. Shawnee warrior chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, a religious leader, fearing the continued encroachment of Americans deeper into indigenous lands, saw that the United States would try to drive a wedge between different tribes by dealing with them all separately. If they banded together, like the Iroquois Confederacy of old, they could give the Americans a run for their money. The territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, warned that Tecumseh was, quote, one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolution and overturn the established order of things. The reason that Tecumseh was so successful at causing trouble for the Americans is because he was able to inspire with his calls to reconnect with indigenous roots, aided by the spiritual movement of his brother. Harrison clashed with Tecumseh's warriors at the Battle of Tippecanoe Creek in November 1811, taking many casualties. But that was just one problem facing the Madison administration. The continuing impressment of American sailors by the British had stirred public opinion to a boiling point. Partisan newspapers tried to exploit this anger by claims that Tecumseh's movement was being aided by the British. President Madison believed that the time had come to ask Congress for a declaration of war. The war hawks, those members of Congress who were bullish on the idea of war with Great Britain, were led by now Speaker of the House Henry Clay and young South Carolina Congressman John C. Calhoun. John Calhoun was a fiery Southerner, fiercely devoted to protecting Southern agricultural interests. railing against tariffs and federal attempts to impose restrictions on the institution of slavery. Like Henry Clay, he would come to be one of the most important legislators of his day. On the issue of defending American honor, they were in agreement. "We are called upon to submit to debasement, dishonor, and disgrace, to bow the neck to royal insolence," said Clay. "When the burglar is at our door, shall we bravely sally forth and repel his felonious entrance, or meanly skulk within the cells of the castle?" The Federalists were of a very different mind. They believed war would be disastrous, not just because America was ill-prepared for it, but because it would disrupt trade even more, which would hurt their industrial northern base. Daniel Webster, no relation to the dictionary guy, or at least not a close relation, was one young Federalist who opposed war, though he would go on to long outlast the Federalist Party, and eventually come to work with Clay and Calhoun. The Federalists weren't wrong to worry. Despite what John Adams thought, it turned out that a standing military was more necessary than ever. Because of Democratic-Republican reduction of the Navy, America really only had 5 warships. Britain had 500. The Army had fewer than 7,000 enlisted men. And how are they going to pay for a war if Democratic Republicans still wanted to keep taxes low? Matching British naval might was probably not going to happen, so Madison's strategy was to push for victory on land by invading British Canada. It went very poorly. From the outset, the Americans were unprepared, having poor supplies, poor leadership, and poorly paid soldiers, and met stiff resistance from the Canadians. They would try again the next year, even burning the Canadian city of York, Toronto as we know it today. But still, they had no success in turning Canada American. Eventually, they cut their losses and decided to refocus their efforts on their defensive strategy. The British felt fairly confident in their chances this time. The French were too preoccupied with war in Europe to come to America's aid. They would be fighting this one completely on their own. Oddly, though, morale boost came from an unlikely source: the Navy. The wildly outnumbered, underfunded Navy that was 1% the size of England's. An American flotilla on Lake Erie under the command of Captain Oliver Hazard Perry was deployed to assist the beleaguered army of now General William Henry Harrison in 1813. Victory against the British there allowed Harrison to take control of Detroit, which had been lost to the Canadians during the doomed invasion. Perry became a naval legend with his exhortation during the battle, "Don't give up the ship." This became a motto for the United States Navy. The USS Constitution became a beacon of hope for U.S. forces, who nicknamed it Old Ironsides, off the fact that the British cannonballs would bounce right off its thick wooden hull, as if it were made of iron. Still sturdy, Old Ironside still floats in Boston Harbor today. Madison's electoral prospects were largely riding on the fate of the war that had overtaken his presidency. Despite a rocky start in Canada, voters did decide to re-elect him, but his main bases of support were largely in the agricultural South and West. The more industrial North was still against the war. This was hardly surprising since trade in New York and New England had taken a hit due to the blockade the British had set up at the beginning of the war. Since England was so distracted by Napoleon in Europe, actual military engagement was sporadic. But this suffocating naval presence off the coast would continue through the next several years of the war. Mostly the story of the War of 1812 is one of blockade and waiting. Tensions got so high under blockade conditions, people losing work, price of goods becoming unaffordable, that some Federalists even proposed secession due to the mishandling of the war, though this was never very seriously considered. The most significant events of the war happened in 1814. The first is the burning of Washington. After Napoleon was defeated and sent into his first exile, which won't last, Britain was able to send reinforcements to take a more aggressive stance in its war with the United States. From their blockade along Chesapeake Bay, soldiers marched to D.C. and burned it in retaliation for the burning of York. Dolly Madison took an 8-foot-tall portrait of George Washington off the wall and absconded from the president's house with as many items and government documents as she and a handful of servants and enslaved workers could carry, right before the British set it alight. You can still see some scorch marks on certain parts of the White House exterior today. The second significant event is the Battle of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. The battle was an American victory, but it's most famous for another reason. To make a coordinated attack on the city of Baltimore, the British sent one land force and another naval force. But the naval force had to get past Fort McHenry. Also in the harbor that day was another boat, carrying a young lawyer. Francis Scott Key had been returning home from some legal business when the bombardment of Fort McHenry began and continued through the night. All of Baltimore was under blackout conditions, so the only way he knew what was going on as he sat on his ship out in the harbor was when a rocket or a bomb would go off, lighting up the fort for just a second. Fort McHenry had this gigantic American flag flying over top of it, impossible to miss even from a distance. So as long as, in that split second of light, he could catch a glimpse of that giant flag, they knew they were still holding on. Come day, Fort McHenry had still not fallen, and the British realized at that point it probably wasn't going to. At least not in time for the British to be able to coordinate with their land force. By the time Francis Scott Key was able to get to shore, he had already begun work on a poem he was writing to commemorate the events of the evening, titled The Defense of Fort McHenry. We know it today as the Star-Spangled Banner. That massive flag that kept flying throughout the British bombardment can still be seen today at the Smithsonian. At about this time in Europe, there are also some pretty momentous things happening. Napoleon had escaped his exile on the island of Elba and had returned to France, determined to reclaim his empire. Great Britain and its Prussian allies were equally determined that he not succeed. Allied forces under the command of the Duke of Wellington met Napoleon's army at Waterloo in Belgium, where Napoleon was decisively defeated. There would be no escape from exile this time. The monarchs of Europe, including Louis XVIII, the reinstated King of France, had already been gathering to brainstorm how best to prevent any further experiments in republicanism. What ensued was a slicing and dicing of European territory, as well as a complex web of alliances. Russia would get parts of Poland, Prussia expanded into modern-day Germany, Austria got Lombardy, Venetia, and Italy, as well as authority over the new Confederation of German states. These European powers would form something called the Concert of Europe, a council that would maintain the balance of power through diplomacy and prevent any future revolutions. The proposer of the concert, Prince Clemens von Metternich, wanted the balance of power to rest with the big four powers, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and Russia, who would ensure that Europe was once again governed by kings, as God intended. This Congress of Vienna essentially marked the end of the French Revolution, though the French will cycle through many more forms of government before getting to the republic that they have today. To recap, in 25 years, the French people had overthrown the monarchy and established a constitutional republic, then suspended that constitution for what they deemed to be a necessary cleansing reign of terror. Historians estimate that between 35,000 to 50,000 people died in the terror, though estimates vary. Most of these people were not aristocrats, and, in some cases, they had even been leaders of the revolution at one point, who had just run afoul of whatever political faction was on the rise. Into this chaos stepped a charismatic military leader, whose adventurism embroiled France in wars with basically every major power in Europe. And in the end, they still ended up with a king, the brother of the one they had executed. So what's the lesson to be learned from it all? Revolutions run the risk of turning into the very nightmare they sought to get rid of in the first place. a worse one in some cases. Get too consumed by the fervor and the zeal of an idea, no matter how noble it might start out, and it will take over all reason. For the ruling classes of Europe, however, the message received was that for them, the storm had passed. So naturally, they threw a party. The Congress of Vienna ball was a very Bridgerton affair. The Habsburgs pulled out all the stops at the magnificent Hofburg Palace in Vienna for all the royal and noble families of Europe. One delegate grumbled about the festivities. The Congress doesn't work, it dances. And this was true, as the Congress enthusiastically embraced the waltz, a dance that had been popular among the German lower classes and was now starting to be deemed acceptable. They ate, drank, and were merry as they basked in the glow of victory. Job well done, everybody. Toothpaste successfully back in the tube. We'll never have to face this type of situation again. It was in this European atmosphere that Britain and America signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812. Though one more military engagement would occur, the Battle of New Orleans, led by a charismatic military leader called Andrew Jackson. The treaty laid out an end to hostilities. All lands would be returned to their pre-war status, and all borders were officially determined by independent commission. And that basically put an end to any British designs on the Western Hemisphere. The Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, said of the experience, "The war has renewed and reinstated the national feelings and character which the Revolution had given, and which were daily lessened. The people are more American. They feel and act more as a nation, and I hope the permanency of the Union is thereby better secured." What's more, the little United States of America had reasserted the fact of its independence. It wasn't British, and it didn't want to be. Even the wealthiest man in this rustic startup of a republic wouldn't have been able to match the decadence on display in Vienna. Yet, this little nation could hold its own against the might and wealth of empires and kings. The War of 1812 added yet another layer to that great American myth. Effort matters more than any hereditary advantage. Epilogue. I don't know if you recall this scene from Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, where the Joker has just stopped the two ferries. On each, he has placed a bomb, and given the people on each ferry the detonator to the bomb on the other ferry. They can either choose to detonate the bomb on the other boat, or the Joker says that he will blow up both boats. I think about that a lot when I think about the state of America. In the aftermath of the bruising election of 1800, Jefferson had to calm the waters. That's why he gave his speech saying, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." He needed to make the stakes, for the losing Federalists, feel less existential. It's all very well and nice to talk about being above factionalism, but that ignores the brutal reality. Politics is kind of a zero-sum game. In elections, there's a winner and a loser. And as much as we would hope that people begin to take the "that's okay, we'll get him next time" attitude towards it, that loss can feel personal. It can turn people bitter and distrustful, especially when, as in the case of 1800, things don't resolve so quickly and neatly. The rate of political violence in recent years would suggest that we're not actually getting any better at this. There's no shortage of institutions in recent years trying to take the temperature down by attempting to foster discussion and understanding. It's just, I don't think the kumbaya thing is working. I'm not saying that we don't need empathy. I think we need lots more of it. It's just, I don't think it's very productive without a more rational and empirical approach. We have to have a plan, because I don't want to just hope that someone isn't going to blow up the boat I'm on. I want to have a way to be sure. I've been thinking a lot about something that I only really made a passing mention of: education in this country. Education wasn't just an afterthought in these communities. It was why many of them existed. As early as 1785, before our present Constitution was even written, Congress determined that new territories would be organized around at least one public school.
Public education is at the heart of the very existence of America. The Founding Fathers were very intentional about that. It's something I'm a little worried about, honestly. There are many reasons for that, and we'll get to them later. But for now, I'm worried that education in this country isn't fit for the purpose it was meant for. In Puritan times, the heavy emphasis on education was for children to be able to read and understand the Bible. In a secular context, the purpose of education was to become a better citizen, replacing the Bible with the Constitution as students' primary guidebook. But to be able to build citizens who can engage with the ideas that make up this country, you need to build people who think, not just react, not just practice rote memorization. Memorization, knowing the, quote, correct answer, can't help you discover your place within society. This actually dovetails nicely into the Romantic period. Before the Romantic period, there really was no such thing as the inner life of the individual. People just didn't think that way. That's difficult for us to even conceptualize because that's sort of our default. We internalize things, looking at them largely through the context of how they make us feel. Before this time period, poets talk about love and devotion, but even that's not really about the author's introspection, so much as it is a declaration to the other person. Look at Shakespeare's soliloquies. They're a prime example of this. You get a look into exactly what his characters are thinking, but not a mention of how any of it makes them feel. You could say that the Enlightenment created the concept of the individual, but it was the Romantic period that defined it. René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." Percy Shelley said, "Yeah, but who am I? And am I happy?" The pursuit of happiness and the American dream are ideas we have come to associate with home ownership, having a physical place in America. And it's true that many of us do dream about having a home of our own one day, especially as home ownership becomes increasingly out of reach for the younger generation. But no one dreams of merely getting by. Not really. No one dreams of existing merely to survive, even though that feels like what a lot of us are doing these days. We know what we deserve, or at least we should. But something that I fear gets forgotten is that we also deserve to be able to hope for more. That once we get past the point of immediate basic needs, we can have something more aspirational to live for, something that brings joy. The Knickerbockers and other offshoots of the Romantic movement demonstrate this budding individualism, a large part of what went into the American psyche. This has been shaped over the years by the pull of the open frontier, fantasies of the open road down Route 66, and the explosion of youth culture. But underneath it all, the beating heart of America still remains the intense longing to be happy, and the freedom required to do that. Freedom from constant and obsessive worry about getting to the next day. Freedom to pursue what makes you happy, whether that's collecting porcelain figurines or building model railroads or whatever makes you glad to be alive. The thing that made America special is that we always believed we were entitled to that. We always knew about our rights and what we were owed, enough to understand what we were looking for in a leader, and when someone was jerking us around. The fact that we seem to be losing that indicates that we don't have an education system that teaches us to think critically. We have, rightly, come to be very skeptical of the phrase, "I did my own research." The thing is, it isn't a bad instinct to question and double-check the things we're told. It's just that most people have no idea how to go about it correctly and end up reinforcing the very behavior they're trying to get away from. But this time, they're taking verbatim the words of some kook on the internet. Better education would help with that. Not just media literacy courses, but better training in how to recognize the things we need and want in our leadership. It's something that I'm going to cover in more detail in the civics episode, But for now, I want to leave you with these ideas. There's a myth that you're probably familiar with: Theseus and the Minotaur. Well, the relevant bit is how, so he could get out of the maze, Theseus used a spool of thread to guide him. This is how I like to think about each of our own personal value systems. What should give us the confidence to make our decisions and trust when something is right or wrong? Wherever life takes you, you need that core thread, dictating what's the right next step, not just being spoon-fed the answer. In that model, you have to spin that for yourself, with non-negotiable, solid standards. Let's call it the labyrinth metric. Once a person has that, then the issue becomes navigating the maze with all the other people with their own personal threats. Naturally, they're all different from one another, and sometimes they go in totally conflicting directions. Yet we all have to navigate the maze without major collision. It has to be a series of commitments that we all make to each other, that we won't let that happen. Maybe we should call those the Dark Knight protocols. Finally, there are 2 reasons why I wanted to end with the Congress of Vienna. You can draw a 100-year-long line from the Congress of Vienna to the conflicts of the early 20th century. It'll go to show that while you can try to put a lid on nationalist sentiment and revolutionary fervor, you can't suppress it forever. The second reason is a bit of a warning against the first. This Congress marks the death of the first French Revolution, and it shows us that revolutions don't always work out. They go off the rails, the it of the people takes over. In France, the arbitrary justice of the Revolutionary Tribunal under Robespierre ended up being far worse than the system it was replacing, which was the reason for the whole revolution in the first place. And the reason that this happened, well, there were many reasons, but the one I'm choosing to focus on is the obsession with purity tests. The idea that you signal that you're somehow a better revolutionary because you think this one way, while your colleague may see it slightly different. That instead of working together to reconcile these 2 slightly different perspectives, one must be completely wiped out. There's not actually a lot of working towards your original goal in that process. In fact, it's kind of doing the opposite, creating an environment that isn't welcoming or navigable for everyone. If I want allies to help me achieve a common vision, liberty for all, I'm not asking that we be perfectly aligned. In a diverse country that encourages freedom of thought, we probably won't be. So in an effort to banish people from a freedom-fighting movement who don't meet certain criteria, you're really just employing another form of tyranny. It's more about consolidating personal power by saying the, quote, correct things. The question of leadership is a delicate one. In a representative democracy, we need to designate someone as the person who makes our decisions. How we go about deciding that, a very important part of that thread, can easily be clouded by hearing someone tell us exactly what we want to hear. I don't claim to have the answer to that. And I don't think lately as a society we've been too good at guarding against that. But every generation has struggled with that as well. The question is, how do we get better? I think the first step is to stop seeing humility as weakness. It's not a crime not to have the answer for everything. No one does. Someone who claims that they do is full of it. We all just need to collectively start recognizing where we need to step in and nudge leadership in the right direction, and when we need to stand back and allow our designated representative to be the sole authority. The caretaker theory of governance asks whether an elected leader is there solely to do the will of the people or to act at their own discretion when they think they're right. Democracies respect the will of the people, but the problem is that the people aren't always right. The popular opinion of the so-called, quote, little guy can be very powerful, and not always in a good way. That's for next time.